I started to think, what would a good leader look like? And I honestly, I couldn't figure out any physical characteristics because I don't know that the physical characteristics matter so much. In my mind, my hypothetical leader's name is Sophia. And Sophia is somebody that's humble. She's somebody that promotes the best interests of other people. She's somebody that is true to what she says, right? And she is somebody who is a peacemaker. I think those are some things you could think about my leader. And the reason I went with Sophia is because the Hebrew word for wisdom is Sophia. And I want a wise leader, don't you? Right? And so I'm looking for a wise leader. So of course my leader's name has to be Sophia. But I want you to just see how wisdom calls out and how when it's personified in the as a woman, right? Like look at Proverbs chapter 8. This is wisdom calling out. And here's what it says, Proverbs chapter 8, verse 1. Does not wisdom call out? Does not understanding raise her voice? Notice Sophia's raising her voice. At the highest points along the way, where the paths meet, she takes her stand. Beside the gate leading into the city, at the entrance, she cries out. To you, O people, I cry out. I raise my voice to mankind. You who are simple, gain prudence. You who are foolish, set your hearts on it. Listen, for I have trustworthy things to say. I open my lips to speak what is right. My mouth speaks what is true, for my lips detest wickedness. All the words of my mouth are just. None of them are crooked or perverse. To the discerning, all of them are right. They are upright. To those who have found knowledge, choose my instructions instead of silver, knowledge rather than choice gold, for wisdom is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her. Who wants a leader like Sophia? Right? Now, really, it's just that term for wisdom in the Hebrew term for wisdom. I want Sophia. I want a wise leader. And did you notice that you're supposed to pursue wisdom because it's far more valuable than gold, right? I was thinking about what is it to pursue wisdom, to pursue Sophia. And I thought about my two teenage kids because, well, one's not a teenager anymore. I just like to live as if they are. But they both have girlfriends, and I know what it is for them to pursue them, right? If you don't have teenagers or have never seen what it is to be Twitter-pated, maybe you can think of like Bambi, right? Where once they find their partner, they're just so infatuated with them that the rest of the world disappears. How great would it be if Christians pursued Sophia or Christians pursued wisdom with the passion of somebody who's looking after their first love, right? Or maintaining their love. That's the kind of call. When wisdom calls out, you're supposed to go after her because she is more precious than gold or silver. But you know, this sermon is not about pursuing wisdom, but looking for wisdom in your leaders, finding a wise leader. And I think James is going to do a really good job of explaining what a wise leader looks like. And now you look at James chapter 3. There's a reason why I think James is talking about wise leaders. We're going to be in verse 13, but listen to what he says. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life and deeds done in humility, right? And so James is calling people to come up and saying, who's wise and understanding? And I think he's looking for us to consider wise leaders, specifically because in the last part of James, he talked about not many of you should want to become teachers because teachers will be judged more strictly or severely than others. Why? Because, well, the teacher is like the tongue of the body. It directs the way that the church can go, right? And James goes into all these different illustrations of small objects leading large objects, like a horse is led by its bit, right? The rider of the horse who controls the reins can take that horse onto good paths, safe paths, or they can take that horse onto dangerous roads, right? A ship is led by its rudder, and the captain of the ship who controls the rudder can take that ship in good directions, calm waters, or he can take that ship towards the storm, right? So James in chapter 3 is very concerned that we make sure we pick leaders in the church that's going to direct the church in a positive way, a way that points towards Christ instead of, as James would say, a way that points towards judgment and idolatry, which he calls Gehenna, and our translation translates as hell. So James is very clearly asking, who is wise and understanding among you? Stand up. Which one of you guys are going to be a leader in the church? Stand up. And it's in that context, leaders of the church. But I don't think that it's only leaders in the church that we should consider what a wise leader looks like. Well, because first of all, like if you remember from last week, I talked about the Great Commission, and we are all called to go out and preach the gospel, right? So in some sense, we are all leaders. And what kind of leaders are we being? What kind of example are we setting to the world around us? And so I think James is not simply talking about wise leaders, but showing us how we can be wise, right? And that's what this section is going to be about. So as we consider what does a wise leader look like, we can examine the leaders of our world, leaders who are led by ambition. And of course, I wouldn't want a leader that's not ambitious, right? We could look for leaders that we agree with, the most knowledgeable, the most educated, right? But that's not in James' list of what it is to be a wise leader, right? James' list is going to look very different. But I want you to write down these two questions as we go through this sermon. I want you to ask the question first, what kind of leader do I follow? Right? What kind of leader do I follow? The second question maybe you want to write down is, what kind of leader am I being? In my circle of influence, in those people that look up to me in some way, right? What kind of leader am I being? And as we go through this sermon, I'm just going to ask you to just keep going back to those questions, right? Am I following the type of leader that James would have me to follow? Am I being the type of leader that James would have me to be? And so let's go ahead and look at it. James chapter 3, verse 13. We'll just read the rest of the chapter, and then I'm going to break it down for you. Here's what it says. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere, peacemakers who sow in peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. That's when James thinks about what is a good leader will look like. Who is wise and understanding among you? Please stand up. He gives a list of virtues and a list of vices. And we can look at this text and we can say, are those the type of leaders that we are following? Are those the type of characteristics that we are displaying? Right? And so we're going to describe the wise leader. And my first point is that the wise leader, right, is humble. The wise leader is humble. It's not a character trait that our world would look for in their leaders, right? And in the context that James is writing to, he was writing to Christians scattered throughout the Roman Empire. Rome did not value humility, right? In fact, what Rome looked for in their leaders was power and popularity. Of course, the problem with power and popularity is they're usually willing to sacrifice principles, right, in order to stay powerful and popular. But James says, who is wise and understanding? Who's the leader that's going to lead your church? And then the person who stands up, James says, let them show it by their good deeds and their humility. A wise leader is humble, right? I love this because James does not say, if you're a wise leader, you want to be a wise leader in the church, then why don't you write a paper about the cultural moment that the church is in today? That's not on his list of if you're a wise leader. He doesn't say, if you are a wise leader, then explain all the aspects of the Trinity without using some kind of illustration that's going to break down in the end. He doesn't say that either, right? He says, if you are a wise leader, let them show it by their good deeds and their humility. By good deeds and humility. That's what wise leaders look like. I was thinking through this in a story of Matthew that happens in Matthew chapter 11, where some people come up to Jesus and they ask Jesus about John the Baptist, right? Because these people who come up to talk to him are followers of John, and they say, are you the one that we are expecting, or should we be looking for somebody else? And Jesus says, go and tell John that the blind see, the lame walk, and the lepers are healed. Right? His deeds. He points to his deeds. Not to anything else. He points to his deeds and says, this is the proof that I am who I claim to be. And then in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus begins to talk about John, and he says, you know that John, well, he came. Let's look at it. It's verse 18 of chapter 11. He says, for John came neither eating or drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man, that's talking about Jesus, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Now listen to this point, because James would agree with it. He says, but wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Sophia is proved right by what she does. I guess if you're looking for a wise and understanding leader, you're not looking for the most educated, the most knowledgeable. No, you're looking for the one that lives the most authentic life. The ones whose deeds show what they claim to believe. And they are deeds of humility, not a leadership trait that our world looks for. Are you following humble leaders? Are you looking for humble leaders in the church, outside the church? Are you being a humble person in the people that you interact with? Because wisdom is proved right by her deeds. The one who's wise and understanding will show their wisdom by their good deeds and their humility. Moses is a leader that we can kind of think through, right? Numbers, I think it's chapter 11, Kathy can put it up, or chapter 12, Kathy can put it up. But it just talks about Moses, and it says, Moses was more wise than anyone else who lived on the face of the earth. No, he doesn't say that. Moses was more humble than anyone else that lived on the face of the earth. But what if it meant the same thing? Because wisdom is proved right by her deeds of humility. And Moses was the most humble person that walked the face of the earth at that time. I got to tell you, I wouldn't be if I was Moses. I mean, Moses braved Mount Sinai. Went up, and Mount Sinai wasn't this gentle like mountain to walk up. No, there was a fire on top, right? And Moses, the rest of the people said, Moses, you go up there. We're too afraid. Moses was so brave, he walked up there. Moses got to see God pass by as he called out his character, a God of compassion, full of love, right? And Moses got to glimpse God. That event was so profound that it left him shining. He had to put a veil over his face. Moses talked to God as if he was a friend, a person. If that was me and that was my list of credentials, humility wouldn't be descriptive, right? I would be boasting about that all day long, right? I would be like, I got to talk to God. What about you, right? But no, Moses was a great leader because he was humble. Jesus also, right? Take my yoke upon you, for I am gentle and humble at heart. Can you think of a person that we should follow that is more humble than Jesus, who in his very nature was God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but humbled himself, taking on the flesh, taking on servanthood? I just can't imagine anybody more like a type that we are supposed to follow than Jesus. And what is it about him? His humility. God became flesh. That's so humble. Are you looking for humble leaders? Whenever you look for who is wise and understanding, is it somebody that's humble? I'm going to read a verse out of Colossians. I think it's appropriate because, it tells us how we're supposed to be. Colossians chapter 3, verse 12. It says this. It says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. Those are some pretty great virtues. But you notice how humility is there? If we're going to be clothed with Christ, then humility needs to be part of that. If I'm looking for a leader, I need to make sure that leader is humble, right? A wise leader is somebody who is humble. Are you looking for a humble leader? Are you being humble in your life? My second point is that a A wise leader does not follow self-interests, right? Because in the text, what James does is he gives some virtues. A wise leader is humble, and then he gives some vices. And here's some vices that he says a leader is not, right? Verse 14, he says, "But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not boast about it or deny the truth," right? You notice the two characteristics that are characteristic of worldly wisdom? Somebody who has bitter envy and selfish ambition, right? That's the kind of leaders often the world gives us as if we have much choice in it, right? But the worldly wisdom is ambitious. And I think ambition is a good thing. Do you guys? Would you want to follow a leader who isn't ambitious, doesn't have any drive? Of course, the problem is if their ambition is selfish, right? The word for envy can also be translated zeal. I want to follow a zealous leader. But it's bitter envy, right? And selfish ambition. See, a wise leader is not self-interested, right? A wise leader considers other people's interests above their own. It's not about bitter envy or selfish ambition. In fact, it says, don't boast about it. I got to just ask, like, if you're wise and understanding and you're marked by humility, is the first thing you're going to do stand up and boast about how ambitious you are? I don't think so, right? You can always tell somebody's heart by what comes out of their mouth. That's what Jesus says, right? It's out of the overflow of the heart that the mouth speaks. And so I know a leader that is self-interested because all they want to talk about is themselves. I don't want to follow a leader like that, especially not in the church. Very little choice in the world, but in the church, where James is talking to us, the leaders that we pick in the church, if they promote self, then they're not promoting Christ. They're not the kind of leaders that we should follow. He says more, right? That's verse 14. Verse 15, he says this, "Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic," right? It's worldly wisdom. So, of course, the three characteristics of worldly wisdom: earthly, unspiritual, demonic. Earthly because it's ground level, right? It's all about what's going on here and now and the problems that we face. It's all physical. It's earthly. It's ground level. It doesn't look up. Where godly wisdom, by the way, begins with the fear of the Lord. So it looks up before it ever looks out. It considers God before it considers the earthly things. But if I'm following a leader that is like he's going after worldly wisdom, then that's all about the earthly problems. He's not focused on bigger picture. It's unspiritual, like meaning very physical, animalistic, right? That's the self-promoting leader. I think the most interesting character trait is that of a self-interested leader is that James says that he's demonic. And we don't like to talk about demons very often in the church, right? It's barbaric. But James says that the leader that is self-interested is following a wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. What does demonic leadership look like? You know, I was thinking about a story because I don't have much, I got to look at Jesus and his interactions with demons in order to see what maybe demonic wisdom would look like. And Jesus gets on a boat and he goes to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and he shows up to these tombs, and out of the tomb a man walks and he's filled with demons. And they see Jesus and they say, "Son of man," or "Son of God, did you come to cast us out? Don't do it. Instead, throw us into the pigs." And so Jesus allows them to go into the pigs. And the pigs jump off the cliff and fall down into the water. See, that's demonic wisdom. It's just bent on destruction, bent on self-interest. And I wonder, are the leaders we're following, are they promoting self-interest? Because a leadership that promotes self-interest is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic, bent on destruction. Verse 16 goes on to say more about worldly wisdom. It says, for where there is envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Right? Selfish leaders lead to disorder. A leader is not wise if they're self-interested, right? Instead, you find every evil practice. I think you can see that inside and outside of the church. I'm going to share a story that I considered not sharing, but why not? There's truth in it. I've followed leaders that were, I would say, self-interested, right? I mean, of course, we all have. We live in a world, and worldly wisdom is all around us. And I have followed leaders in the church that were self-interested. I can tell you they were self-interested because they made mistakes or did things that ruined their marriages and brought a destruction to the church. Splits. Now, it had nothing to do with their knowledge of the Bible. They knew it well. They taught it well. They taught me well. But they made choices based off of self-interest that brought disruption to a church. Why? Because they were led by self-interest. So when James says, who's wise and understanding, let them show it by their good deeds and by their humility. If you're following somebody that is self-interest, promoting self instead of Christ, you are following somebody whose leadership is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Paul dealt with it. We deal with it all the time. Paul dealt with it, right? In the Corinthian church, they get a letter from Chloe's house, right? And it says there's divisions among you. That's the problem, and there's divisions. I'm going to read this out of 1 Corinthians. And he talks about the divisions that he sees in the church. And I believe this is 1 Corinthians 11, and I must not have marked it. Or 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and I must not have marked it. But in chapter 1, verse 11, it says this, my brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household have informed me that there are quarrels among you. What I mean is this, one of you says, I follow Paul, another says, I follow Apollos, and another says, I follow Cephas. Right? Still another, I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized into the name of Paul? See, what was happening at the Corinthian church, I do not believe Cephas or Apollos or Paul, I don't think they were led by self-interest. I believe the people that followed them were led by self-interest. And so they began to promote one leader over the other, so much so that Paul was horrified by the fact that some people would follow him above Christ. And so he says something that I can't even imagine. He says, I'm grateful I didn't baptize that many people, right? Was Paul crucified for you? Like a bunch of rhetorical questions that basically point out that Paul's purpose was not to promote self, but to promote Christ. And when people gathered behind him as if he was the one that was being promoted, he couldn't believe it. And so he goes on to say, verse 14, I thank God I didn't baptize any of you except for Crispus and Gaius. Because he couldn't imagine that people would look up to him instead of Christ, because Paul promoted Christ. I think a wise leader is somebody who is not self-interested. Is that the type of leader that you're following? Is that the type of leader that you are being? My third point is that a wise leader is sincere. A wise leader is sincere. And what James does is he gives a list of virtues. So you've got some virtues, followed by some vices, followed by more virtues. And here's what he says. But wisdom, this is verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure. Then it is peace-loving. Then it's considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Right? Some virtues. The kind of leader that we should be longing to follow, the kind of leader that we should be going after is somebody who is pure. Right? Unlike the salt water and the freshwater spring that I talked about last week, right, where James asked, can salt water come out of a freshwater spring? Of course not. Can fig trees bear olives? Of course not. can grapevines bear figs? Of course not, right? The point that he was making there is that if you claim to be something, then you should be authentic to what you claim to be. You can't be double-minded. You can't be mixed with the world. You are supposed to be somebody who is pure. Well, guess what? Godly leaders are pure. They're not double-minded. They're not just pure, right? They're also peace-loving. Not the absence of conflict, but they're going after unity between one another and between God. They're helping to promote unity. Notice how self-interested leaders bring about division, where leaders that are following wisdom that comes down from above is peace-loving, promoting unity. Here's something else. He says they're considerate and submissive, which means they can't be self-interested. How do you be self-interested when you're considerate? How do you be self-interested whenever you're submissive? No, the leaders that we should follow are the ones that promote Christ rather than self, right? Consider other people's needs above their own. Submit instead of demand. He says they're full of mercy and good fruit, which makes sense. You know, all these virtues make sense because when we read chapter 1 of James, he talked about the fact that wisdom comes from above. And if you ask God for it, he'll give it to you as long as you believe and don't doubt. And so if wisdom is sourced from heaven, given to us, shouldn't it have the characteristics of Christ? Right? Shouldn't it be pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy? And if you're wondering what that looks like, James has already showed us. He said that it's taking care of widows and orphans, not showing favoritism, feeding the hungry, clothing those who don't have clothes. It's a wisdom that is proved right by her deeds because it's merciful. And I love the last one he says is that this wisdom is sincere, right? And I love the word sincere because, well, it means literally without cracks. I don't know if you knew that, but sincere means without cracks. And it comes from, I believe it's Greek in origin, but I'm not sure. I should have probably looked at that before I started talking about it. But I believe it's Greek in origin. And the idea is that most everything that all your cups and your plates would be made out of, from a pottery, right? A potter would make that. And they would make it out of clay and they would shape it. And then once it's shaped, it needs to be put in the fire. And then the fire would harden it. And then it's painted and sold on the market, right? That's how it goes about it. But if you don't make the clay right, or if it doesn't dry evenly, what happens is it cracks. Well, if you are a crafty potter or somebody who's led by worldly wisdom, right? What you're going to do is you're going to see that bowl or that cup that you made has a crack in it, and you can't sell it now, well, unless you fill it full of wax. And then you paint over it. And now you can sell it in your market, and guess what? Nobody knows that it has cracks until the paint wears out and the wax goes away, and you go to take a drink out of that cup, and you realize right away it had a crack, right? Because you got milk or something all over your shirt. But if you held that cup to the light, you could see the imperfections. You could see whether it was true or whether it had cracks. And I think that's true about Christian leaders, wise leaders. When you hold them up to the light of God's word, well, you're going to see a lot of imperfections because even James said that none of us is perfect, right? We all make mistakes in several different ways. You're going to see imperfections. What you're also going to see is whether or not they are sincere. We want to follow leaders that are sincere. The opposite of sincere is obviously hypocrisy, and Jesus uses that to talk about the religious leaders of his time, right? They are play actors, putting on a show. I want to follow leaders who are not hypocritical but sincere, right? Humble leaders. Leaders who are not self-interested. Leaders who are sincere. And lastly, my last point is we want to follow leaders. A wise leader is a peacemaker. A wise leader is a peacemaker. And James just says, he gives us a little like a proverb in verse 18. He says, peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I don't know what you're looking for. Like I asked you in the beginning to write down, what do I look for in wise leaders? Am I being a wise leader? And I think James describes a wise leader as somebody who is humble, somebody who is not self-interested, somebody who is sincere, and somebody who is peace-loving. And that last one, I think, really reminds me of Jesus. That's his mission, right? God so loved the world that he gave his only son so that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. See, Jesus is the example of a wise leader. That's the, like, if you're looking for sincerity, hold somebody up against Jesus. They'll fall short every time, but at least you'll see their cracks, right? Jesus is somebody that was humble. God became flesh. Jesus was somebody who was not self-interested. He died on behalf of me. Jesus is somebody who was sincere. There was definitely no hypocrisy in him. And Jesus is somebody who is a peacemaker. Not just any peacemaker, but he humbled himself to the point of death. Peace through conflict. He had to destroy the powers of death through the cross, through his resurrection, and then 50 days later, his ascension, where he sits next to that throne in heaven and he pours out the Holy Spirit, enabling us to put on the virtues of Christ. See, I think as you just consider, what does it look like to be a wise leader? We have one standard. It's Jesus. Are you following him? That's the question. You're going to find unperfect leaders all around you. But are you following Christ?